This is the Central Valley PolitiCast, and it's the first one with a new logo. I'm very happy about that. As we were talking about before this started, I went and drew my name in there with Will Silverstein. I think that is the big news of the day. There's nothing to do at all with the fact that we have a
Right.
vice presidential pick, and that pick is Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. He didn't seem to be on the radar when we talked a few weeks ago. It seemed like there was a look for more moderate candidates. Tim Walz is maybe a little bit more progressive, is the thought behind him with kind of this appearance as America's dad. It seems to be what the Democratic Party is going with still an appeal to that Midwestern base. Is that a good characterization of who he is?
Yeah, I think so. I will say he does meet kind of the generic qualification, which is someone who, if they win, Democrats are not going to be losing a seat. They will be able to take over the governorship with another Democrat in Minnesota. But yeah, I mean, he has the appearance of someone who is moderate. Republicans are already making hay about the bills that he signed as governor and how liberal they are. But he is not someone clearly on the left of the Democratic Party, but someone who has in the past governed kind of from the center.
I think if you look at Tim Walz, you see a couple of things going on. For about the last 10 days, it's been between Shapiro and Walz. Yeah, sure, we heard, discussions of Mayor Pete. We heard discussions about Andy Bashir. But the other folks were never really kind of in the running. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is internally, what the Harris campaign is grappling with is someone that the Obama team likes. And the Obama team liked Governor Shapiro quite a bit. He's a close relationship with former President Barack Obama. But Shapiro is a guy who never completed a term in Pennsylvania politics. It was unclear that he could deliver the area between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and much of the state. He's also someone who's not a number two. He's clearly ambitious and would overshadow the vice president running for president. And there's another component to this. Tim Walz is the highest ranking non-commissioned officer to serve in the U.S. House. He had a number of House members, progressives and moderates in the Democratic caucus who were pushing the Harris campaign team to bring in Governor Walz. You also had progressives sending out emails saying Walz is the guy because of his union record, because of the legislation that Keith mentioned that he's passed in the state. But at the same time, you had some moderates pushing Shapiro. So this kind of drug things to the end. And then Kelly's kind of out there, as the alternative. And sure, Pennsylvania has 19 electoral votes. That's a big number. It's much bigger than Arizona's 11 or Minnesota's 10. But by bringing in America's grandpa, what you've done is kind of bookend the Rust Belt states. And you have a guy who the Kamala Harris team knew Bidenomics was not polling well. They knew that Trump as a threat to democracy was not polling well. And this is a guy who starts talking about Republicans as being weird, particularly J.D. Vance, and that kind of went viral. And kind of captured, Will, I'm going to say, like your logo here for the program, it's going to go viral. And as that component goes viral, it really captured the attention of Kamala Harris and others in the Democratic kind of ethos and their mantra, and that helped push them forward. There's another component to this, though, that I think Democrats, while celebrating and patting themselves on the back here, especially in the last 2 weeks, all the money they've raised, the momentum, the new polling data that we show that has her slightly ahead. Look, Democrats better hope this isn't 1972 because there are going to be visuals of Minneapolis on fire in the wake of the tragic killing of George Floyd and the riots. And those are going to be juxtaposed or partnered with homeless in San Francisco. And those visuals, those ads are going to write themselves and say, do you want this to happen to America? Now, crime, immigration, we know those are going to be central issues for what happens in this campaign. But if you're Kamala Harris and you're Tim Walz, you're going to say, look, this isn't 1972. It's a different dynamic, and we're willing to really meet that head on. And I think they know that those challenges are ahead. It should make for a really, really exciting race and a heck of a vice presidential debate if we have a vice presidential debate.
Well, I just wanted to point out that I said America's dad. You went with America's grandpa, but just not to age him, but I think that's true, right? Because there are a lot of weird parallels as we're using the term weird between those two times in history, between the end of the '60s, early '70s. Early '70s, last time Minnesota was a Republican state, won by President Nixon at the time. Now you pick the governor of Minnesota. A couple weeks after some polling had showed and suggested that Minnesota was back in play, Trump performed well there in 2016. This seems to lock up that state and perhaps does a good number for the rest of the Midwest. And as it relates to the protests, too, I know we've talked before about the worries about the convention and what could potentially happen there. You have someone who was in leadership in Minnesota during the time of the protests and riots in Minneapolis and St. Paul. It was the epicenter for it and what started a movement across the country at the time. Nowadays, too, it's not immune to a Chicago protest. And where have we seen a Chicago protest before at a DNC convention back, 40, 50 years ago? So it's a lot of similarities between that time and now in a divided country. At that time of Vietnam War, maybe nowadays you have inflation very similar to what we had back then. Of course, the other on the war front in this case. We have foreign conflicts across the world that maybe the U.S. isn't involved in from the perspective of having troops on the ground, but there is a deep interest in Israel and Ukraine. So lots of similarities. What do Democrats do differently? Because it didn't go too well for them when in this situation in the past. Also, you had somebody from Minnesota, by the way, Hubert Humphrey on the ticket in 67. So that was your political fast note, fun facts lesson. I don't know why I'm telling two professors this information, but what am I going to do?
I mean, so yes, there are parallels to the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. I do think that, like that period, we are right now doing some realignments within the parties. It's a gradual process, of course. But even then, it's not the tumult that we saw during that period. We don't have in the news on a regular basis assassinations. And I know that there was an attempt on former President Trump, but it's not something where we are seeing assassinations of major political figures on, every couple months or so. We don't have large-scale riots happening in major cities and, fires that are burning down cities right now. We are at a tense point. Polarization between the parties is as great as it's ever been. But there is this undercurrent of people don't disagree as much as political elites fundamentally disagree. There is a kind of moderation and a desire for kind of a regular order among the electorate. And even though people will say that, yes, I want people to agree, but I want them to agree on my terms, right? And as someone who studies kind of voting behavior, I see that in the data all the time. But there still is this undercurrent of we are a single country and we ought to be able to get along. So I don't want to push the parallels to the end of the 60s and the 70s as far as some people have been pushing them.
Yeah, I think that's a
By the
really
way, you can say some people included me after that 5 minutes.
I think that Keith kind of really hit the nail on the head there, because there are a lot of differences. Obviously, this coming August is the 50th anniversary of Nixon leaving the presidency. Okay, so that's something that's hugely important, but it's also a period of time where we've gone through Donald Trump, and Donald Trump has upset all of our models and our recognition of rules and the things that we thought were, rules of American, fundamentals of American elections and American politics. So it is fundamentally different, and certainly Nixon started a lot of that tumult and moved forward. But also, Tim Walz has done something different from most politicians. He said, look, we messed up our response to what happened in the wake of George Floyd's tragic killing and how the city handled that. And most politicians, not just Republicans, but Democrats too, are doubling down on their mistakes. They often don't say, we messed up. And one of the moments that I think helps Democrats and Walz in particular move up is that he's willing to admit fault, and he's willing to say, look, the other side is like this, we're like this, and we're not always perfect. He's done this when they talked about legislation for feeding kids breakfast, and talking about being a monster for putting kids with full bellies in a classroom so they could learn. He's like, woo, what's so evil about that? And so this moment where he actually takes a pause and acts sensibly, whether he's America's dad or the grandfather or whatever it is, he says, look, you're casting seen us in this light, but this is what we're trying to do. That sensibility and making an apology is actually unusual in our politics, despite the normalcy that voters seek. And I think he provides that kind of defining line that provides them at least an opportunity to continue the narrative. The other component is that, look, he's hugely popular in Minnesota. His popularity is almost 15 points higher than Joe Biden's, but the country doesn't know who he is. So they also have an opportunity to introduce him and create that narrative and contrast that with J.D. Vance and the upheaval or chaos of Trump. That's fundamentally some important differences from, say, 68, 72, and so on.
Yeah, and as we want to turn this back to locally here, I think the one thing that we're really interested in was turnout in California House races and turnout in California in general. And it was very low turnout in the primary. A lot of people say, well, it's a primary. Well, it seemed historically low in a primary too. And we had some data that supported that information. And obviously, maybe one of the best examples is the other district in this county, in Kern County's district, where you had, even though a lot of times you see a Republican winning by a lot in Kevin McCarthy's district. This time you had two Republicans that managed to finish 1 and 2 in that special election. And then you had a pretty decent showing between Valadeo and Mathis, polling right around 55%. When you added their two totals, that'd be a 10% difference in a district that's supposed to lean Democrat. And of course, some good polling for Republican Michael Maher up further in the Central Valley as well into our Fresno area. The reason I say that is we now have a Californian who's leading the presidential ticket in Kamala Harris. You have maybe more of an energized pick coming as well with Tim Walz, who's going to bring something a little bit different. Should we say weird if we want in that situation, but something that maybe drives a little bit of turnout. And of course, just the overall wave of momentum that she's received, of course, both that she's done, but then also that Republicans have been giving her, it seems, as well, by throwing out some remarks following President Trump's appearance at the NABJ event. So what is the impact of Harris on this election down here in California 22 with Valadeo and Salas? Is this the boost that Democrats need in the Central Valley?
So I think the main thing that has happened is a re-energizing of the Democratic base, Democratic voters, giving them a reason to care about the election rather than kind of a resignation that, oh gosh, this is what we've got and we have to try and support it. So it creates opportunities that maybe if Biden had still been the head of the ticket wouldn't exist. Simply because people are excited about the possibilities now, whereas before it really had the sense of kind of a resigned slouch toward the end that nobody was excited about, and we'll just go through the motions because it's what's expected of us. But now there's a real possibility of, or a sense that the election can be won, and therefore it's worth putting the effort in, whereas before that sense just did not exist.
Keith, when you talk about that resignation and that slouching, it just makes me feel like I'm headed to a faculty meeting because that's exactly the same.
Yes.
Or, a meeting with editors or something, just, oh,
Yeah.
God, the dreaded, like, oh, we have to do this again. Anyway, I think that one element of this where it could be helpful is if you look at the 6 targeted races in California. California 22 is at the bottom of that list, right? It's not the Katie Porter replacement in 47, or it's not the Garcia Whitesides race in 27, and some of the other races. It's at the bottom. And when Salas is running against Valadeo in 22, Valadeo outspends him by almost 25%, almost $1 million. If you look at cash on hand today, Valadeo's ahead, but only by about $250,000. So Salas has the opportunity to close that race. The fundraising gap is closer, the dollars are closer, and so if the DCCC, if the D-Trip can funnel money into races that are not just at the top of that target of 6, but actually reach the 6th race, that can close that gap, which makes a difference. You also have registration numbers for Democrats that are in favor there, the Biden numbers there. It makes that race really tight. So I'd argue to you, actually, of all of those races and what happens, California 22 might be the most interesting because of the fundraising closeness, the registration and presidential vote closeness. That makes 22 all of a sudden really a coin flip, where a few dollars could make a big difference. And it would be actually much more exciting and it's by a factor of 10 compared to a faculty meeting or a meeting with editors and management. And so in that sense, I think it has the opportunity to get scooped up into that enthusiasm. But I also want to remind your viewers that, look, we haven't seen really an effective response by Trump and Vance against Kamala Harris and Walz, kind of waiting. Yes, they'll get a bump after the convention, but this race will be virtually deadlocked or close. And even if Harris is ahead after Labor Day and that traditional kickoff, that problem of gender and racial bias, you can't ignore that. They have to be 3 to 5 points ahead in those swing states to have a shot at this race. And if they're not going to be there after the convention, then it still is an advantage Trump before they've even gone effectively on the attack. So that's just an element of caution here. While Democrats are, they've had a honeymoon of 2 weeks. That's going to continue here in the near term, but they also haven't faced big pressures pushing back on them either.
Right. I think that's going to be what's the interesting thing that happens in the coming weeks is once the honeymoon period ends, you're going to go and you're going to say, okay, what has Kamala Harris done as vice president? I know that there's this idea to get rid of the former title of border czar, which was informally given to her by the press. Lots of press redactions since. That's definitely going to be a talking point. And then, as you mentioned with Shapiro, someone who is very relatively new to the scene, who hasn't yet completed his first term yet. I think there's a question of, okay, she was only in office for 6 years as the senator. She had a brief period of time there as attorney general as well. And of course, as a prosecutor in Oakland. So she's had these quick stints and quick jumps. And then people are going to say, okay, what was inside the record that she had? And then I think then again, too, everyone's going to be, especially on the right, it's going to be pointing to Governor Walz being the governor during the time of the George Floyd protests breaking out in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And probably you're going to see videos of that on a bunch of political ads, especially perhaps in the Midwest as well. We may not see them as much here in California, but it definitely seems to be a national play.
I think Keith, I think Keith is right in the sense that they've got clear momentum, right? They've got that, but they haven't been hit. And when we're looking at places like the politics of the Valley, that could be an important component of dollars, fundraising, and enthusiasm. I mean, like voter attention in a place like the 22nd. And so if you're going to win the House or you're going to hold the House, that path is through California, through New York, I'd argue, but also through California, through these seats. So that makes election day, every vote matters, but it makes election day, election month, very exciting time in terms of counting the votes.
And then at the end of the day, too, it's what are the issues here in the 22nd, and is Representative Valadao addressing them? And of course, he's the unicorn in terms of people who have voted to impeach former President Trump and maybe stands out differently amongst other Republicans. He maybe has some more immunity in areas of attack where other ones that are more vulnerable districts maybe don't have that same type of rub to them, because you're not going to probably see a Trump endorsement of him anytime soon, and likewise on the other side of the scale, just politically viable for both.
Yeah. I mean, I like the term that you use there, the unicorn, for Valadao, right? Every election cycle, people wonder how he survives, given the makeup of the district, given the partisan registration in the district, given the voting patterns in the district, and yet he survives. He is well liked within the district. He's able to kind of stake out his own ground that is separate from the rest of the Republican Party, have his own identity that really connects in the district. And so in an age of nationalized politics, it's still kind of this throwback to, if you can win your district, you'll be successful. And he's been able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's something that's kind of unlike anything we've ever seen as far as the numbers and the way that they've shifted. And of course, we're going to have this test again, because lots of those districts, as you had both mentioned before, up for grabs in California and in New York, a couple of areas where Republicans bit back to get that majority in the House this last time around. Just looking at the fire response as we go briefly into these last couple topics, we've had a major fire, biggest fire in Kern County's history out this way. How does the response of the funds from the state and federal government, what role does that play on this district? And I'd also like to say too, because I've covered the stories in the Kern River Valley from last year where there were a bunch of floods, and a lot of people in the Kern River Valley still feel like their infrastructure there is not quite fixed. And then throughout the rest of the Central Valley too, in more populous areas, you have farm workers that were displaced. You have some lost money that could have been collected in a year where you don't have those catastrophic floods. If the infrastructure is maybe suggested to be better, it could have just been that type of flooding. But I think a lot of people are looking for investments in this district. What effect does response to fires, lack of response maybe to flooding over the last couple of years have on voting districts throughout the Central Valley?
So I think it's kind of sets the context in which contests take place. So if people feel like the response has gone well, then they're going to be more disposed to kind of respond positively to the people who are incumbents in those areas. If, however, they feel like the response has gone poorly, that their needs are not being met, that they're being ignored, then there's going to be some antipathy and a desire to replace. We are in an era of nationalized politics, and so a lot of dissatisfaction at the local level gets transferred to the national parties, and whichever party happens to control the White House at that moment in time, whether or not that really has any impact on how local agencies respond following a natural disaster. But that's just kind of what happens at this point, that local responses get transferred to the national parties, which then get transferred back down to local candidates. And so to the extent that people feel like they've been heard and that their needs have been met, then that maybe helps Democrats a little bit here and there. But to the extent that they feel like they've been ignored or that their needs haven't been met, then that helps Republicans.
Yeah, it's hard not to be cynical or crass about this. I mean, if you look at disasters and we talk about floods, fires, and that they're nonpartisan, right? That they affect all parties. And then you look at what happens in the response and afterwards. You have districts, you have a blue state, you have districts that are represented largely by Republicans. You have districts that voted for the recall of a governor in a state where the recall was thrown back 60-40. And then you go and you ask for dollars and to get those back, and you get ignored, is what happens. Or the response tends to be slow. You see this for counties that push back for COVID restrictions. You see this for counties and areas of California that don't vote the right way. And this is not uniquely Californian or just with Governor Newsom. That's just politics, man. And this is what happens all across the country. And so the aid comes slowly. Now place upon that a state budget that's in a difficult place. And you have this backlog of demand that's headed into 2026 when more than half the legislature is turned out. This is a difficult time to get response and dollars back, given the environment of nationalized politics that Keith just talked about. So I think that those frustrations that voters have are understandable. They don't feel like they're being heard. I also think it makes it incumbent upon Republican politicians out of the blue areas in California, when they're going in Sacramento, they're going to have to find more common ground, and Democrats have to find more common ground. And that difficulty of consensus is directly the opposite of electioneering. We're great at running for office and calling each other names, but then we have to come together and give each other a group hug and try to do things that help advance us, like, for example, in the wake of a disaster. And that is really much harder in our politics than it's ever been before. And it's not like these disasters are going to stop, regardless of what you think about global climate change. There needs to be a lot more consensus and cooperation. And that seems to be, I think, a difficult moment. And we're headed for the next 3 months into a period where consensus and cooperation and recognition of the other is gone. That unity thing was a fix, a short fix for like 24 hours. So I think it is going to be difficult, and it is understandable. It challenges our politicians, I think, and that's where the locals can play such an important role in terms of what's happening. That's what local politics matter in such an important way, especially under these circumstances.
What a great segue to this last question as we want to get you off here before 9:30. I want to talk to you about, just real quickly, just to update everyone on this Zach Scrivener situation. Essentially, we're going to be losing a supervisor in Kern County for a brief period of time. A lot of people would suggest we've already lost him due to medical leave that we've seen him take. in the last several months following some interesting allegations. How important is this fast turnaround for candidates? We're going to have a candidate list, I believe, due at the end of the week on Friday. And then how important is that representation locally? Because I know a lot of people are going to be looking and say, hey, this is going to be another 4 months or so where we're maybe going to have to wait on a replacement if the governor doesn't jump in there. And then the last point on that, too, is that how important is it that it's actually at the same time as the general election? It's in the same, likely going to be on the same ballot. As opposed to special elections we've seen recently, where it's been this need to, shoehorn in a window where we can. And Professor, I know if you have to leave, Professor McEwen, no worries. I know we're running up against the 9:30 time here.
So it's, I think the fact that it's happening during the general election changes the dynamics. You have a different pool of voters that are going to be paying attention. You have a different pool of voters who are going to be participating in the election. So the kind of electioneering that takes place is broader. It requires more. It asks more of candidates than during off-year elections or during special elections. And also it makes it just harder because the news is not about local politics. The news is about national politics, and it makes it really hard for anybody at the local level to break through and be heard as a local candidate. It's a really tight timeline for candidates to get qualified for the ballot. I mean, the board decided yesterday that this was going to happen, and candidates have until Friday to get all the paperwork in, which is crazy. It's just insane, but it's probably better that it happens this way than the governor making an appointment for 2 years until the next election. And it's certainly going to be cheaper for the county to have the election happen now than to try and run a special election later.
Yeah, I think those are all really salient points. The timeline, especially, it rewards a local politician, someone who has name recognition and some resources, because the way you're going to cut through in those messages is you're going to have to go digital. And digital is not necessarily expensive, but it is going to require a number of resources linked with that name ID to cut through what's happening nationally. Certainly what we see in terms of local politics and these types of scandals, allegations, no charges, no arrests. Nonetheless, we have seen episodes of like this, and they destroy not just political careers, they destroy families. And if you're the board and you're a colleague here, what you want to do is get ahead of this as much as possible. So you've got to have this on the ballot because you have to move on. That's what the voters deserve, and that's what really good governance calls for. So I think in some ways, moving forward, saving money, and at the same time, even though it's the chaos of what is maybe the most interesting election of our lifetimes and the most controversial, it's certainly, if you're a local poll, you have to be looking at this, because also you're going to have to be talking about things about moving forward and healing people, and why that's an important element and what you bring to the board in terms of collegiality and consensus with that tight timeline that Keith just talked about.
Well, I just also want to say thank you so much, for both of you joining us today, and to wrap up on that topic. I didn't want to seem like I was rushing Professor McEwen off, but I know we both had things at 9:30. But the real reason I'm trying to rush him off is because if he doesn't trademark "That's Just Politics, Man" from earlier, next week on this background, you're going to get "That's Just Politics, Man" right behind me.
Every week you can have a theme from one of your guests.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, I'm gonna have different titles in the backgrounds for everyone's Zoom background. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much both for joining me this morning. I really appreciate it. This is a major week for politics. I look forward to joining you joining us again sometime soon. And as always, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Happy to be here. Thank you for asking.